Nobody talks that way unless you're a mathematician. Oh, I moved to Mexico. Mexico's here.
But it is
Nobody talks. You can start with people at least.
Ready to call this work session? Are they good?
It used to be hard to get.
Jason or
All right, board, with it being 6:31, I would like to call this meeting to order with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. Dr. Ramos, would you like to start us off here? Are you making the presentation?
I am. So thank you, board, for coming tonight, and to our guests in the room and people watching at home. We've not had a work session in this format since before COVID started. And just to remind everyone, this is an opportunity for us to come together in a little bit less formal of a setting, to have the board, depending on the topic, have an opportunity to look at data, have some discussion, ask questions, and give us some marching orders moving forward, how you might like us to proceed, or other avenues, to explore and research as we move forward with the process. And so we thought that doing this with the capacity study and the demography study and capacity report would be a great opportunity as a first topic with the board. And we really hope over the course of this year to do this with multiple different topics. I do want to welcome, in addition to our executive cabinet members who are Dr. Will Vanderpool, who's our Director of Alternative Learning, and Jen Simpson, who is our Director of Transportation. The three of them, along with the Director of Facilities position when we have it, and then working closely with Zach Brady, who is our internal data analyst for the district, each year use our internal capacity information and enrollment information to look at projections year to year. So they're really focused on making recommendations of, we need an additional section of second grade in a specific building, or based on this we might reduce a section. Over the years, that group has provided some recommendations in regard to soft boundary changes. So when we had growth at certain buildings over the past decade or so, and we needed to shift some students, that those discussions and some of those recommendations have started with that group. And so they're here tonight. They've been a part of these discussions, and although I'm going to do a lot of the talking about the slides, I'm hoping that they will chime in often with their thoughts. And please feel free along the way to stop and ask questions. If it's something we anticipate getting to, we might let you know that we'll get to that soon, but really this is meant to be more of a dialogue and discussion as we work through the slides.
And we do have Janet here on the phone. Sorry, I forgot to mention that earlier.
So just what we'll go through, we have the demographer study that we're going to spend a few slides talking about some of the key findings from that. From there, we're going to talk about some of our internal capacity review and discussions that we've had and how that aligns with or corroborates or not the study findings. And then to talk about really what are the next steps for the district as we move forward based on the information from the study and our internal enrollment projection. Last January, the Board of Education approved a demography study. We're in the midst of the discussions around the Prop S work, the budget shortfall that we have for completing the work that was originally approved back when Prop S was passed, and understanding that multiple projects that are still on the Prop S list were designed and built around enrollment projections. So we needed additional space in the classrooms because we anticipated enrollment increases. The discussion was that we wanted to get an outside perspective and information on what patterns and trends we saw based on changes in the community with new construction, building, to really either reinforce or bring to light new information that we hadn't been considering when we looked at our overall enrollment projections. An RFP was conducted, and ultimately Preston Scott with Business Information Services was selected. He came highly recommended, has done just under 300 studies across the nation, highly regarded, has done a lot of work with Wentzville and their growth over the years, but stuff not only in Missouri, but like I said, throughout the country. He's the one that completed this study for us. The RFP really went out, and there were two purposes. Like I mentioned, needing some additional information as we move forward with Prop S, but really trying to identify the community changes. You can't drive throughout this community without seeing a significant amount of growth and new construction taking place. But what does that impact actually have on enrollment in the district? How much of that new construction is leading to students enrolling in Francis Howell? And really thinking not just the next year or two, but over the next 5 to 10 years, what implications might that have on the district. I'm not sure of the last time we did a formal demography study. And again, we have an internal team that does the work, and year to year we feel good about those projections and then the numbers that actually matriculate. But it was important to spend the resources to get the outside feedback. And the scope listed there really was looking at enrollment analysis and the projections, capacity, so looking at the square footage of our existing spaces. Based on that and the numbers, do we have room in buildings to add additional classrooms, students, a potential boundary analysis based on what that found, and then what other external factors exist in the community that could be impacting our enrollment. So the key findings, if you've had an opportunity to look, and it's a lengthy study, it's about 125 pages, and a lot of that is backup data to what was found, but highlighting some of the key things here. Ultimately, you'll see we had a peak enrollment back in the 99-2000 school year in Francis Howell School District of almost 19,000 students. And over the past 20 years since then, we've had a slow decline. There was a little bit of an increase when we had the transfer population join the district. But outside of that, it's been a pretty steady decrease over about 20 years of about 13% total. The study came up ultimately with 3 different models, and we'll talk a little bit more about them in a couple of the next slides. And it ranges from a 1% decrease to a 9%. So overall, every model they look at and every outcome, there was nothing that talks about an overall district increase in enrollment. Every model looked toward a decrease. At the high end, they call it, of 1%, which in looking out over 10 years, that would put us down to about 16,000 students. At the lowest end would be a 9% decrease that would actually take us down to just under 15,000 students in the district. And that's a significant change. You know, a 1% change over 10 years, nominal, but 9% could be pretty significant. The study cited several factors which generally would positively impact enrollment in a district. So they talk about a 3% increase in the number of childbearing age women that they expect to see, and I think that was over the next 5 years, which they talk about being a moderate impact on the district. Generally that's something as we see more women having children would have a positive increase. Now the overall percentage of childbearing women as a percentage of the overall population decreases, but that's because the study also talks about the population within St. Charles County and within our school district areas will continue to increase. They cite an increased number of children under the age of 5, and that one could go up as much as 13%. And he identifies that as being a solid factor that would have a direct impact, usually, in a school district on enrollment. And then the number of school-age children 5 to 17 also was expected to increase at a moderate rate, which he looks at about 2%. However, if you've taken the time or had a chance to look through the study, he also cites that where you normally expect a positive correlation between those factors and an increase, that's actually the inverse in Howell. So we have all this new construction, and we've had it happening over several years, but we're seeing this slow decrease in the number of students enrolled in the district. They talk about the large number of retirees, and often when you think about a community and people retiring, they move out of the community, go to smaller homes, downsize, and then there's an influx of families. The data that is in the report doesn't indicate that that's actually happening here. People are retiring, but right now they're still staying in their homes. We're not seeing this in-migration of younger families coming in as of right now, and the information is here. They also talk about, by and large, in the past 10 years, we've had an improved economy. Couple of years, but jobs, the number of opportunities here, again, we would normally see from that a correlation of increased population, which we have, but that's not equating to an increased enrollment within our district. And so when you first look at the study, for us, that caused us to pause and really question, is this accurate, what's going on? But that's what the study provided, the information the study provided us with. Another thing that they talk about is the strength of the homeschool and private school enrollment in the district. So back in 2000, approximately 86% of the students that live in the Francis Howell School District boundaries were attending public schools here in Francis Howell. In the 2010 census data, that actually had dropped to just over 80%. We don't have the 2020 census data yet. That should come out this spring. In there, I think he speaks to one vendor that they were able to pull information from, and that one showed 89.1%, but he said he doesn't think that's accurate given the decrease that we had on the prior census information, and encouraged that to be a data point we monitor when the census data comes out. This study really predicts that we'll be much closer to where it was in 2010, around 80%. And then the last positive thing that he does talk about for the district, which again, you would hope would encourage people to move into the district and want to be here, is the rankings of the district. And he talks about the niche rankings, which, you know, we know that that's just one metric and measure that's out there, and we were thrilled this weekend to see that that came in, and as a district, we're still ranked number 8 in the state and number 7 in the St. Louis region. You look at MAP scores and the DESI metrics, that we still rank high. Again, that's a data point that usually we would say is enticing people to come here, making this a destination district for families, and ultimately would lead into increased enrollment, but that's not what the study shows. So as we reviewed the study internally, there were several areas that we just spent some time really thinking about. Over and over again, the study indicates that the district is an anomaly. You know, when you see new construction, an increased overall population, increase in the number of children under 5, school-aged children, childbearing aged women, all of that would lead to increased enrollment. And in every one of those cases, it's either a decrease or an actual inverse relationship. And he provides some backup for why they believe that's what's happening here. And for us, the takeaway is really, it's data points we need to continue to monitor. Because I'll show you in a few slides that we see those predictions as being accurate, at least this year in the 22-23 school year. As you drive through the district, like I said, there's a lot of construction taking place. We have 2 brand new subdivisions coming online in the Cosley attendance areas. There's a lot of construction taking place in Warren. We also know that new sewer lines are being laid out in the southwestern part of the district. One of our team members just sent a text last night of 600 acres near Defiance that's going up for sale. There's a lot of potential growth either happening or soon to happen in this district, and it's important to note the study does not take that into account. If the homes are not existing, if it's not already happened, it really wasn't considered as part of this because they weren't built yet. You know, as we've seen before, sometimes the economy turns and you plan a subdivision and then it doesn't actually get built or there's delays. And so that was something that gave us pause and something that we need to really continue to look at, knowing that it's not included in there. And then the last thing here is he does talk about the impact COVID had. And not necessarily just people choosing to go virtual for a while, but recognizing that some of the restrictions that we had in place the last several years, whether you liked the restrictions, you didn't like the restrictions, impacted your choices for schooling. And ultimately, we probably would have been better to wait until this school year and with our fall data right now to really use that, because there is going to be an anomaly in the data over the past several years, and it's going to take some time to really see ultimately how that plays out. So what he provided in the study is projections over the next 10 years. On these slides, we're going to look a bit more closely at that, as well as the current enrollment in the district. This slide really shows what I shared before, that when you look at 99-2000 there, when we hit our peak, and then that slow decline that's happened, you see a little bit of a bump over 2012, 2014, and then the decrease has continued really since then. This slide, which I know isn't the easiest thing to read, this shows the 3 models that were developed. That line there in the middle, which is referred to as the medium enrollment projection, really was looking at, and it's light blue if you see it there, that would be the 5% decrease over the next 10 years. And then from that, he developed a 4% variance on either side. So the high end there, which is the top line, which is dark blue, that's if we had the slow 1% decline in enrollment over the next 10 years. And that bottom line there, the green line, would be the other extreme of 4%, taking us to a 9% decrease in enrollment over 10 years, where we would end with just under 15,000 students in the 2031-2032 school year. These enrollment projections were developed in the study. It talks about using the census data, kindergarten enrollment data year over year, and some of those trends, live birth trends that are available within our district, which is tricky because the way our, normally when you look at birth data, it's by zip code, and we have multiple zip codes that are split between multiple districts, and so it's not the easiest thing to use in predictions, and he acknowledges that. And then looking at cohort changes. He does provide this information building by building, and I'll show that in a couple of slides, but really does emphasize that for the purposes of this, it's really better to look at the district as a whole, because building by building, the changes in kindergarten enrollment each year have a drastic impact on the building's enrollment over time. And just a small change of 20 to 30 students in a kindergarten class will drastically impact the enrollment then over the life of those students in the building. Howell is also challenging when it comes to predicting enrollment because only 5 of our elementary schools feed into only 1 middle school. The others feed into either 2 or 3 different middle schools, and then only we have 2 middle schools that feed into multiple high schools. And so the idea of looking specifically at cohorts and as they move through the district is constantly shifting. And so we can do it, but in some ways looking at these overall numbers for the entire district is important. It's not on this slide, but in the study he also did another trend line based just on our enrollment data over the past 10 years. It's a purple line in the study, I don't remember which page it's on. That too would indicate a continual decline. It's not as drastic as the 9%, but it's just above that line, light green line, so about a 7% decline following our current, or the last 10 years enrollment that we've actually had within the district, which really reinforces his findings here with these 3 lines. So this slide does show, although I acknowledge that looking at building by building isn't super helpful, I think in this case it reinforces, as we questioned the findings in the study, and I'll be honest, when we saw it, we thought this has to be wrong. We're not gonna, with all of the construction happening in Francis Howell, we cannot continue to lose enrollment. That just doesn't make sense. But then we're at a point now, we were able to look at our current enrollment this year and where we're at. So to look specifically at Becky David there, what you're seeing at the top, the high enrollment, which would have been a 1% decline over the 10 years, he indicated we would have been at 764 this year, 761 would have been the median, and 758 in the red. You'll see there though, what's on that second line was our current enrollment as of about a week, 10 days ago. So Becky David is at 816, which is actually 52 students higher than his high projection. I keep saying his, we're Mr. Preston that did this thing. So you see Becky David and Cosley are a little bit higher, but then we have Central coming in 5 students lower than even the low projection that he had. Fairmount also coming in low, Harvest Ridge high. So what's important there when you look at the overall elementary, we're actually 65 students higher than what he predicted with the high this year. A little bit higher than the 1%. And it's 15 students overall where we were at over K-5 students last year in the South School District. This slide looking specifically at our middle schools, again you'll see Barnwell right there in between the low and medium, Bryan a little bit lower, Almond a little bit higher, Almond lower, State higher, right in line with his high prediction that came in. It's actually down 33 students than we had in our middle schools last year. And then when we look at our high schools, all 3 buildings are a little bit lower than the low projection. We're about 62 down from the low end he had at 5194, and that's down 41 students in the high schools overall, grades 9 through 12, from where we were at last year. So this slide here just summarizes it. Again, shows you elementary, we're up a little bit, middle school's right in line with that high projection, and then high school coming in lower. So when we look at the fact that, well, this study must be wrong, this can't be right given new construction, no, we'd say in year 1 of his 10-year prediction, we're right in line with that. 16,279, 0.36 of an overall reduction in our student population from last year to this year. So that's in our minds, well, that reinforces the information that's presented in the study, and it's a data point that we'll continue to watch as we move forward. So the next section of the report got into capacity. And the hard part here, I would say, is that it's confusing because there are multiple different ways you could look at capacity. The main way that he talks about is using a gross square footage. So just what is the overall square footage of a building based on the number of students and allocating a certain square footage to each student. What that doesn't account for is some buildings have larger hallways. When you go to Central, which was built right here across the parking lot from us, was designed to be able to have grade level meetings at the end of the hallway. So there's large spaces of square footage that are not necessarily used in a classroom or for instructional space, but take up a significant amount of square footage in a building. If you have large stairwells, if you have a larger office space, all of that impacts that model. And so it's a challenging model to use. He does another analysis looking at the number of classrooms that are in the building and just divides that up by students. Another one is the number of students per classroom. What that doesn't account for, though, is that in Howell, we have been fortunate that overall our class sizes are better than you might find in some other districts. And so choosing to have smaller class sizes ultimately impacts that analysis and that way of looking at the capacity of your building. And then the last thing he used, the fourth method, was looking specifically at classroom square footage and trying to get an average between our buildings. I'll be honest, one of the challenges is that we do not have architectural drawings for every single building that provide perfect data to provide to the demographer to give that information. And so tried to go back and provide some updated information to him, but it's not exact. And really, as you walk through some of our buildings, some are designed where the classrooms are very consistent in square footage and size. You go to other buildings and it's very inconsistent. We have some kindergarten classrooms that are huge and allow for play areas and rest areas and learning areas, and then you go to others and the kindergarten classrooms are quite small. And so when you think about comparing those, it's just a challenge. So what he does in the study is he shows each of those four methods separately, and then also has an area where he combines them together. Well, when he combined those, looking specifically at our elementaries, I believe he says that we're at 71% occupancy. If you go visit all 10 of our elementaries, you don't leave feeling like there's room for 30% more occupancy in our elementary schools. Yes, one or two of them, you definitely feel like there's some space to expand into and do some different things, but we have several other buildings where absolutely not, we're exceeding the occupancy. The other thing that I don't know that part of the study takes into account is how programming has changed over the past 10 or 15 years. When you think about, special education services that we offer, reading services we offer, gifted education. Once upon a time you might have had a counselor, and now we have behavior support specialists, emotional support counselors, school guidance counselors. All of those positions take classroom space, and it's great things that we're doing for students, but when you think about capacity, it's all not necessarily taken into consideration here, which makes that portion of the study challenging. So what we did, our internal capacity committee, and we didn't all get to go to all the buildings, but different parts of the team went and actually walked through every single one of our elementary schools with the principal, with a diagram of the building, and walked through every single every single space in the building. So general classroom spaces, our specials, so your art, music, PE, the reading classrooms, the nurses' offices, really looking at everything to see how it's being utilized, because that's really important for us as we make decisions moving forward. As we did that, it gave us an opportunity to really talk about the functionality and the adequacy of spaces within our buildings. I've been in Henderson multiple times in my 2 years in the district, but to actually walk through that district, I know we've had patron comments, and other people come to the board meetings where they talk about learning in closets. And at Henderson, that is happening. They have had to use every single space in that building to provide instruction. We are going to offer opportunities, if you haven't, as a board member, had an opportunity to go visit the building. We talked about doing a meeting or two at Henderson or at Fairmont in the future, but you really need to be there during the academic day and see what's taking place. Because if you don't know, students at Henderson have to walk into a gymnasium where balls are being thrown, people are running around, to go into a line because the cafeteria kitchen is attached in the gym. So they walk into the gym where class is taking place, get their food, and then we have kindergartners and first graders carrying a tray of food back out into the gym where all this is taking place, to go back into the hallway, where they walk another 25 or 30 yards down the hallway to get to an old multi-purpose space that is now their cafeteria. It doesn't have everything. Henderson was originally built at the middle section of that building was an open air library, which was probably an amazing architectural feature when it was built, and it was a cool new thing to do. Well, over time, that has become offices, that's become reading classrooms, that's become art classrooms and music classrooms. So in multiple rooms, there are 90-degree angles and corners, and then stairwells that lead to nowhere in those rooms. Those art rooms have portable sinks, so every single day, an already taxed custodial team in that building is taking 5-gallon buckets of water and having to go empty them in another place, bring back water for the next day. So it's not ideal, and it's especially not ideal in a district such as ours that does have the resources and means to provide great learning spaces for all our students. So those are the type of things that we're looking at when we talk about functionality and adequacy of spaces. And I know previously at the roundtable feedback night and the facilities committee has looked at, they talked about equitable spaces, and people were confused about what that meant, and that's really what we're talking about. If you attend one building what does the learning environment look like, the classroom spaces, versus when you go to another building that doesn't have some of those same factors in place. So our team on the internal walk placed buildings here, and this is not an exact science. I'd be happy to share a little bit more if you have questions about why the buildings are in these categories, but really we have Henderson and Fairmont that continue to be in a high concern area. I would say that is less about the current enrollment in the building and the overall number of students and the general classrooms, kindergarten through 5th grade, as it is the overall usage of office space. In those buildings, as part of Prop S, there was a discussion of one of them having a new gym, the other having a new cafeteria. And when you would do that, it would allow remodeling of the existing space to create music or art classrooms that would be appropriate for the school, or to have better offices or small classrooms for reading instruction, for English as a second language services, that type of thing. Those two buildings, there's still significant opportunity, and because of the high enrollment in those buildings, that does contribute to it, that there really is nowhere else to move students to. If they were to have an increase that required another classroom or two, we're now having to take classroom spaces away from some of those other programs that are already in less than ideal classroom spaces. So those two buildings are there. The medium concern, part of that might have been enrollment in those buildings. It could have also been just monitoring some of that construction that could happen. So Cosley does have several new neighborhoods going in. And although we've had an inverse relationship between new construction and student enrollment, if that begins to shift, that building right now is okay with instructional space and students in each classroom. They have a little bit of room to add some students or maybe shift a classroom or two, but there's not a lot of them. And then in the low concern, we were careful to say not no concern, just lower concern. Central and Harvest Ridge both have some space right now and it feels okay, but again, monitoring changes in enrollment at any time, it could shift in those two buildings. I don't know if anybody on the team wants to add anything more about those visits to dental entries.
I would just say, Ken, to echo some of your comments, just about the equity piece of Henderson and Fairmont. It's more about some of those basic services that I think we want for all kids just not being there. It's not about having this fancy thing or this fancy thing. If you really get an opportunity to walk in the building, Henderson is the only building in the district that has a cafeteria set up the way that it is. And some of the instructional places where we are sticking adults and kids in are less than ideal. They also have a heavy ESOL population that's very different than maybe some of our other buildings, and that takes classroom space. And so they've seen a shifting demographic over the years that takes up some of that instructional space as well. And then I think some of the medium concern buildings, just not knowing for John Weldon, Independence, Warren, what some of the corridor off of Highway N brings to us here in the future. We've done a soft boundary change, Will, like what, in the last 3 years?
Yeah, 2018-19.
To those buildings, and we've shifted some enrollment away from Warren to Independence and to John Weldon. But if we do get a pocket of kiddos that move in and we do see an increase in that, those buildings have some capacity, but not a ton of capacity.
Yeah, Independence we consider full right now. They don't really have any rooms to move kids to. It's not a high concern because it's just full. Like, we don't need to do anything to the structure of the space. It's just full. And John Weldon's closed, but what we planned on the soft boundary changes was around 80 kids or so moving from Warren there, and it's exactly what happened. Warren went from 900 to around 750. Both those buildings picked up kids quickly and kind of filled their empty classrooms. But if there's sewer lines that go in and Daniel Boone starts to feel stressed, John Weldon would be the next entry point. If Weldon Springs decided to take all the acreage they've got and turn it into starter homes, they would both be in a very different place.
Another, I don't want to say an anomaly, but he did predict in the study that we would have an increase in our kindergarten population this year, and in the end, our kindergarten population based on current enrollment is down about 50 district-wide than we anticipated. So it was almost every possible data point in that study that we thought would have gone one direction. The data indicated something a little bit different. And Independence is an example. He showed at that high level would have been at 739 this year, 733 on the low end. We're at 749, so just a little bit higher than what he predicted. And as Dr. Vanderpool said, Independence is full, but as long as that doesn't drastically increase, they're okay, but it's a building that we would want to continue to monitor, and that's true for several of those. So there are multiple data points that internally our team is closely monitoring and will continue to do so. One will be the 2020 census data when that comes out here. It's supposed to start to release in May, and different pieces will be released between May and August of next year. He really says that's an opportunity to look. He was making some assumptions based on some of the other vendor data when it came to retirees, and then the change in population of 40 to 44-year-olds says he's decreasing. I think he also says that 18 to 25 is also decreasing in the district. But when we get that data, we'll actually be able to see what it looked like when we did the census several years ago. We continue to monitor, and there are, between HR and some of our other departments, they're actually looking at this right now on a daily and weekly basis as we start each school year. But what is our current actual enrollment data, and what does it look like? What shifts are we seeing? How does that compare to what our internal projections were that we did? And I'll be honest, the team was actually very happy that our internal projections are pretty accurate. You know, we do a good job of using our own internal ratios and cohort modeling and feel good about that. Like I said, looking specifically, and it's not just Cosley and Warren areas, but we keep identifying those because there are large developments taking place there right now. Like I said, the southwestern area of the district, where we know there's a lot of land for sale, sewer lines are being put in. What impact will that have? The good thing there in that area is that that's not going to happen overnight. We'll have several years to anticipate those changes and monitor them as they might happen. And another thing that comes up that he mentioned early on, the strength of the, it tells us strength, the number of families that choose private schools within the district or homeschooling. We get some non-public enrollment data, so our students who are enrolled in private schools at the elementary level, that we do, some of our federal funding goes to them, so we're aware of some of those students. There are also a lot of private parochial high schools, though, throughout St. Louis County and St. Louis City that our students go to that we don't necessarily get that information, so we don't have clear information, but the census data, when that comes in, should give us a little bit better picture, too, of where we're at 2 years ago to see if it was aligned with a 2010 number or if it's gotten better since then. So then for us, it's really, so how do we use this information? One, I don't know that we really learned anything that we didn't already know, in the sense that we're aware that our enrollment has slowly declined over the past 10 years, and we didn't have anything that indicated that would drastically change anytime soon. I would say the two key takeaways for us are, one, that there's nothing that indicates that there is overall going to be an increase in enrollment or a drastic increase in any one building. So when we think about the remaining Prop S work, if you go back to the Comprehensive Facilities Master Plan, I think there was some confusion out there that people said, well, you said there were going to be classroom additions in each of the buildings. Well, no, part of a facilities master plan is saying in every given building that you have, if there were growth over time, where might you put some additions? So if you actually go to the facilities master plan, all 23 of our schools show where you could have additions of classrooms in multiple areas. It was never an intent that we would do that in every building, but whether it's Central, Daniel Boone, Henderson, Hollenbeck, any one of our schools, where might we build those spaces? But specifically around Fairmont and Henderson, there was a discussion of do they need an addition of classrooms? And we would say right now the answer is no. There's no need for, and when I say classrooms, I mean a general education kindergarten through 5th grade classroom. Now that does not mean that Henderson and Fairmont on the Prop S list, when we talk about the cafeteria, the gym, the remodel of existing spaces, absolutely needs to happen for other reasons. We just don't necessarily need to do that and an additional classroom wing of 8 to 10 classrooms. The other question that we anticipated through all this, if we had found some enrollment changes that could be significant, would be, do we need to have a discussion around boundary changes? And not just soft boundary changes, but redrawing boundaries within the district. That is not a conversation that anybody ever wants to have, whether it's from an administrative level, from a community, a patron level. Oftentimes people choose to live where they live because the school's there, and that can be a challenging change for people. There may come a point in time when we need to talk about that. We need to engage our community and our stakeholders and what that might look like. We don't see anything in the data right now that indicates that that needs to happen for next year, or that there's an immediate change for that. Immediate data indicating that needs to happen soon. But it's a data point that we need to monitor, and what our plan would be at that point if we had data that began to indicate we might need to do that. Like I said, we would at that point ask the board that we would form a committee and spend a lot of time really engaging with the community to talk about it and to make the best decisions for the district. But we do not see anything here that indicates that that needs to happen. As I already shared, we feel that it does validate the work that our internal team is doing when they look at the data each year and reinforce a lot of the projections that we make and the decisions that we're making around staffing in each of the buildings and class sizes. We had shared when we were talking about the Prop S work, which we had said right now as we work through the process review, we're waiting for another month or two around next steps with some of that. But we do feel like the conversations need to continue with both Henderson and with Fairmont about the other work related to Prop S that needs to happen in those buildings. And again, not adding 4, 6, 8, 10 classrooms at Henderson, but what are we doing when it comes to potentially a new, is it gym? Henderson was the original one, that would allow us to shift some other things and really look at that core area of the building that is now serving 20 different functions. Once we have a new space for a gym, how could the existing gym be remodeled to move some of the offices and again, art, music in that building, special education, some of those, and to think about those spaces. So I don't want anybody leaving when we say that we don't think this shows a need for classrooms, that we're talking about not doing the work in those buildings. Those two buildings are still of high concern for us, and the work needs to happen, and this will just guide what those next steps might be. And then the capacity team is meeting on an ongoing basis. I plan to be a part of that team in those conversations, and again, looking at the data multiple times a year so that we're using that to bring information back to the Board of Education, using that to guide some of the work with Prop S and our facilities committee as we talk about next steps. And if at some point in time the data indicates that we need to be talking about boundaries or new buildings, additional classrooms, we would respond as appropriate to that. So that was really our overview of slides with our internal discussion and review of the study, and then I want to do some time now to hear the board's thoughts as we've had an opportunity to look at the study, or if there's other questions that we might be able to answer for you tonight, or if we can always go back to the demographer and get some other information from him, or ask our facilities committee or other groups to look at internally.
I'm curious on your internal capacity review. You have all the elementary schools listed, the middle schools or high schools. Is that because you don't feel that they're concerned at all, or just because the first view was just elementary and those still need to be done? How does that work?
Yeah, so when we originally received the report, his model for predicting, this amount of square footage, this number of kids, seemed to align with our secondary schools. It seemed to fit and be accurate. And knowing the buildings, we didn't see a need to dig a little deeper. But the elementary schools were skewed. We saw the need to maybe close a school or two, and we could consolidate things. But knowing the buildings and just what's in them, it didn't make sense. That's one of the reasons why we walked through all of them to see it. But we have in the past gone and done building tours at the secondary sites, especially North, Hollenbeck, Barnwell, to talk about what's happening and do we need to do anything different. But the spaces, every classroom's being used for something. It's all being used for something appropriate, and it really we haven't had a need to address it.
I think there is some remodeling work that needs to take place in some of the buildings, for sure. But it wouldn't necessarily be big adding on construction.
Yeah, I think the original Prop S plan was for Barnwell, Hollenbeck, some of those older structures to get some updates, kind of like Becky David did, repainting some flooring, things like that, but nothing.
I did find it interesting in the formulas. I know Ken, you kind of hit on it a little bit about the number of standard 25 kids per classroom, I think it was. And I know in our elementary schools and other classrooms, a lot of the levels we target 21, if I remember right. So those are just conversations we're I think in this district lucky to be able to have, and don't have to say how many kids can we cram in a classroom, and those are some of the differences I think from that 70% utilization which you mentioned.
Absolutely. And that's, again, a topic that when we think about, it's all interconnected. So capacity, finances, student-teacher ratio, that all comes together. But, we weren't, I would say that we didn't feel completely when we tried to share that information that was necessarily taken into consideration as part of the study. And so it was a distinction that we wanted to point out that impacted part of the capacity study.
I do want to say too, the class size piece, we have, I think only 2 of our elementary schools share a similar floor plan. And so you have a lot of different, regular classrooms that look different from one building to the next. And a great example is John Weldon had a wing that was originally designed, I think, for 6 early childhood classrooms. They moved out after a couple of years, and they use one of those larger spaces as a team teaching room for 2 first-grade classrooms that can only have 17 in them because of the size. So we have a lot of weird anomalies in the district that just make, and if we were to increase class sizes, you couldn't do it uniformly across the district because you'd have a tiny classroom here that could still only fit 22 kids, and another room that might be large enough to fit 28. It would create a lot more inequity.
Something else I'll point out or maybe mention was looking at the study, and from your conversation as well, is those projection enrollments are kind of like, that's the base, and if anything happens, that could spike up to who knows where, if they start building in certain places, and depending on exactly where they go and who moves in. So definitely something I appreciate you saying. We're going to continue monitoring everything and comparing it to what the numbers are.
And they point out in the study that when you think about even the retiree data, and one of the reasons we want to see that 2020 census data is at some point, all indications would be that will begin to turn over. He talks about the cost of new housing, new building in this community that is not often, making a lot of assumptions here, but young families with young children are moving into it. That's a little bit later often, so what impact does that have? Talking about some of the new construction, and we know that there have been some apartments and condominiums that have been built, but are those being occupied by families with children, or is it just single or individuals or couples?
And when the capacity teams met over the years, Zach Brady's really good about being able to break down that data, so we can take a subdivision and he can tell us in a subdivision that's 25 years old with 220 homes, how many elementary students are we getting? And then if we have a subdivision that's going up or starting to flip over, we start to compare, especially when we start to look at, maybe we need to move boundaries, we look at that subdivision data to get a sense. And that's why we know in those apartments that they're building, they could put 300 units, but the apartment complex they built 3 years ago, we get 15 kids from, even though there's 300 units. So it really allows us to predict what's going to happen.
We also talked, an opportunity we would have, and again, not knowing, Becky, David, and Cosley going up this year, is that an anomaly? Will that continue next year? But if we see that 2 years in a row they've had an increase, then we could actually survey those specific families that are new to the, did you move from within the district? And sometimes we have that if they were here and just changed houses, but if not, if you moved into the district, why, what drove some of that might give us some additional information just to have as we make some decisions and monitor changes in the data.
We had any discussion around, we talked about the increase in homeschooling and private schools, doing any additional marketing research with those particular families to see why they're not choosing, especially a school that's rated quite high in the state, on why are they not choosing to go here, and is there anything we're doing to drive them off versus something that they're just making that choice because rural education or whatnot.
We didn't discuss that. I think that's a great opportunity that to find those families and to do some surveys and get some feedback.
So that last data was from 2010, right?
So in the census data, he talked about they used a vendor that they were able to purchase the most recent data that they could find, and it doesn't identify who. Some of that is their own sources, but he said, I think that was 2018 that was the most recent vendor data they were able to get. But that's the one that seemed like it hit 10% more of the students were now back in public schools, and they didn't get that data as well. So we'll have a data point before the end of this school year that should give us more feedback around that.
Okay. I mean, I know just last week, St. Charles, they'll be closing up to 70% of our parochial Catholic grade schools because enrollment is so incredibly low. We're going to get really hard with that. They haven't announced which ones, of course, but they're saying an estimated up to 70%. So I do question that.
He also sorry.
No, go ahead.
Another, just anomaly about Francis Howell is that, looking back over the past 20 years, they said normally in a district that has a higher number of students in private schools, when you do have a dip in the economy and the increase in unemployment, that tapers off more, the kids come back to public school. And looking back over the past 20 years, they haven't seen that in the district, that it's actually increased slowly over time.
With the data that I was using for federal funding distribution for the 4 private K-8 schools that we have in the area, there was 1,215 students currently enrolled in the elementary schools right now.
In all 4?
That were actually Francis
That
Howell
were
residents.
Francis House students, yes.
Because I think we've seen, especially St. Joe's and Powellville there, people, that school's been booming, where St. Joe Manan, just up the street here, has been losing enrollment, so. Yeah, there's a draw with certain schools.
Yes, the Cottleville was at 590 Francis House students.
Normally you would see, because of sports and other programming, that you'd have an increase when it comes back to high school. You haven't necessarily seen that, so again, it's just data point after data point is counterintuitive to what you'd normally expect.
Just for clarification, for the homeschoolers, that data that they got from the vendor was from 2018, or was that something else?
I believe that one was private parochial, not.
I think it will be very hard to get a real finger on how many kids are homeschooled.
Right, no,
That's
and the reason I'm asking is
missing
because
link.
obviously I think that there is a natural increase in those just due to the COVID, and those will probably re-enroll into public school, just conventional thinking there, but I think a lot of the expectations of what this report would have is kind of counterintuitive what our conventional wisdom would be thinking it would.
Yeah, he just
would
said,
actually see. Yeah.
just as market share based on the best vendor data we could buy, estimates that 89.1%. So I'm guessing on the census they probably did ask, are your kids homeschooled or private? So that might have a better number.
I think it is important to note, though, that in the state of Missouri, unlike some other states, homeschool isn't tracked. There's no record of where those children are at. They're just gone. And so there's really no way to know how many kids are truly homeschooled. They don't have to register. There's not really a requirement. There's not any accountability. There's no one assuring that the children actually get an education. Some people provide really high quality homeschool experiences. But that is, those kids just disappear when they homeschool.
Yeah, so I think you've already alluded to it. I think monitoring it would be important just because of the anomalies from COVID, that if something starts not tracking right. Is there any kind of tool, mechanism, methodology that he has alluded to that if we do see different numbers because of COVID being one of the anomalies, that we can adjust accordingly, or is?
So we're not provided any of the form, it's not a plug and play that we can now put in our current enrollment and see how that impacts moving forward. Had a recent conversation with him, and I think he would be open to providing some additional feedback, but at this point, anything significant going back, it's basically redoing the study again.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, I would like to think that when we get some of that census data back here shortly, that if it reinforced this, or if it was different, to ask him in general what he would predict.
Maybe this is a better question for Lou, I guess. Does this give us a certain amount of information that we can use kind of going forward to analyze new data that we've already been collecting? And
I think it depends on how well it aligns to our current reality and moving forward to see how predictive it will be. We use a cohort survival method, and we make some adjustments. So if we have a class of 100 at Becky David, and we traditionally see them lose 2% every year, then we would expect the first grade class to be 100, the second grade class to be 98. And we adjust for anomalies because we have big groups that sometimes come through. And that's provided some very accurate data even when we're doing it 9 months out. So I think for us, the study gets really relevant the next 2 or 3 years, and then after that, unless it just perfectly aligns with what we're seeing in real time, it's not going to provide us a lot.
And I think when we've seen some of those blip classes, that's where we've had to make some adjustments through that soft boundary process. Sometimes we have enough internal space, and sometimes we don't. We can kind of see the trend coming forward. All of our schools occasionally have a group that's working their way through the building that's a little bit larger than others. And usually it self-corrects itself once those kids kind of funnel out. Howell High is a prime example. They had a large senior class this year, and they had a small junior class, right? It's kind of an anomaly both ways. Becky David, they had a blip they had a larger number of kindergartners this year than I think we expected or predicted them to have. Obviously for our group, I think probably the hardest areas are always kindergarten, 6th grade, and 9th grade. And kindergarten, just because of the unknown. And then 6th and 9th grade, just because of transitions in and out. We get kids from parochial schools that come in, and we have some kids that transition out to go to parochial high schools, and even some of like Chaminade that has a 6th, 7th, 8th, they're 6 through 12 place. So we'll lose some kiddos there, but overall, when we see that pattern, Doug, start to unfold, that's where we've started to have some conversation about, do we need to do something from a soft boundary standpoint? The last one was Warren and Fairmount, and making some adjustments there that have been relatively successful to ease some of that tension in those buildings.
And then as far as his initial projections go, since they're, what our current enrollment is pretty in line with what he has, I wonder, did he have access, or did we provide him with registration numbers that he would have a better idea for this year than he would say for future years?
No, I think, so we provided him the same enrollment data that goes to DESI, so he would have had last October's CE.
No, we gave him, he did have the DESI historical counts, but we also gave him information in the spring that was current.
But it wasn't kindergarten enrollment data.
We didn't know, kindergarten registration was kind of midway at that point, we didn't have anything.
And then especially since this is a public document, I'm assuming we're gonna keep it on the website, is there, if we are, that is, especially when it comes to capacity and then what's in this report, are we gonna have any kind of disclaimer if somebody, or something attached as a additional document, so when somebody reads that, they're not gonna take this as an exact science and say, well, why haven't we done this? We need to close 3 schools.
You mean back to his recommendation? Yeah, so he also, part of this would have been boundary recommendations, and he does say in there that if we had the extreme over 10 years and 9% decrease based on a current 71% capacity, that we would be looking at closing buildings. If you go visit our 10 building, you can't imagine how in the world could we ever close a school building right now. And so, yeah, I think we can talk about how that could be attached. It's loaded in the board doc, so we could put something in the notes there just to acknowledge this. Because at the end of the day, this is a snapshot in time. And the reality is already if he were to complete this study right now based on our current enrollment, it might look different. We would expect with the census data once it's available, it will look different. And so it's going to be hard, like Dr. Vanderpool said, we get another year down the road to really base too much on this.
Ken, there's some, and I don't recall the page number, but there's something in his report that talks about the further out, the less reliable any of these demographic studies are, right? I mean, we find that even with our own capacity team, if we try to project 7 years down the road and we continue to reflect on that year by year, we might see some subtle differences or changes that happen even in our own numbers, just because of some of those classes that might be a little bit larger, a little bit smaller, and can have an impact on that building. So the further out, yeah, I think if somebody read that and said, well, in 10 years this is going to happen, and they should be doing these things. I think there are other districts around this area that have made some decisions like that in the past and then found themselves reopening buildings within 3 or 4 years that had been shuttered. And I don't know that looks good to your, to your community. It's certainly not great to shuffle kids out of a building and then 3 years later you're bringing them back.
What else we got, Board?
I'd love to give a little history on Henderson. It was built in 1985, 37 years ago, and it was the premier building of St. Charles County. We had, if you go down the hallways, a phone room. And all the other elementary schools were jealous because we had one phone room for all the primary hallway for teachers to use. And we had one phone room. A stage was built. Not all schools were getting stages anymore. The stage has never been used. It's been a music room the whole time. If you go inside, it's all inclines. That's because we were very progressive, and we still are. It was the building for all the physically handicapped children. There's not one stair in Henderson School. As you walk through looking for stairs, there's none. So it was built to house our physically handicapped children throughout the building. The hallways that go nowhere were actual hallways for mobilization of moving children throughout the building, and they were immediately closed before the building actually opened in 1985. Henderson grew to like 1,100 students. We did cycles. I taught second grade there at the time, and I was in the nurse's office. We were so overcrowded. The nurse's office has moved down. We're a different classroom. But I mean, it's just a lot of history. But it's funny that was the premier building, and it's always dealt with that overcrowding, and now it's a dated building. But
They also built bathrooms in the teacher's lounge of the premier building
oh yes,
that have open vents that you walk through in the lounge where you eat your lunch.
yes, exactly.
And the phone room sign is still on the wall in the hallway.
Yes.
So,
But Becky David and Fairmont did not have a phone, not to brag.
hopefully we get Henderson back to being a progressive,
Yeah.
amazing space.
It's a great sport.
Can I make an observation? I think you'll like it.
What else do we have?
I think you'll like it.
2 seconds.
No, I'm disappointed in the study, all right? And I question how accurate it is, because as you highlight, you did a great job of summarizing, Dr. Rumpus, that he can't find any correlation to anything that he would normally base his forecast on, right? And so I question, how good is his forecast? If you go back to one of your early slides where you showed, and you talked about that there were 3 methods he used, my interpretation was I wasn't sure what the method was that he actually used, because he can't tie it to birth rates, he can't tie it to housing. I'm trying to think what the other one was. He can't tie it to anything. And so as I'm trying to read it, I'm saying, well, what did he really use? And he talked about that just following the current trend. And I'm thinking, why would you just follow the current trend? I mean, I could have done that for free, that's nothing. But what he's forecasting is the trend continues. And so I don't know how good his study is.
And that's the proprietary piece, that is intellectual property, that we don't know some of the methods. And we asked the same question, how accurate is this going to be? And when we saw a draft at the end of last year, and we provided the additional, tried to give additional square footage information, but I'm not a demographer, that is not my area of expertise, but the only thing that I would say is, going back to this slide, ultimately our current enrollment is in line with the 1 year in projection where he was at. So I think, again, only time will tell if that pattern continues and it's in line with what he projected, or if we begin to see an increase and things change, then we'll recognize.
Yeah, I think the high and lows that he had were 4% plus or minus. That was his confidence ratio based on the analysis. And so it wasn't 3 different methods, it was one method. And then the further as you go to Mark's point, the further out you go, the less accurate it is. And his confidence ratio was 4%. And that's the high
Can I
and
make
low.
a point of order? Just for simple procedural, since we're doing a work session here, and we've been recently sued for public comments, I value what you have to say.
I get it.
I just don't want to get into a trick
Email.
bag if somebody else wants to comment later and then we have to cut them
Yeah.
off, so.
That's fair.
I will say, if I said 3, it was not 3 different methods, it was 3 models, which, yes, was based on an average one of the 5% and then the 4% variance on either side.
All right, board, what else?
With respect to capacity, do we not know what our capacity is? Like, has the team not gone through and said, okay, Henderson has space at, at the low end of 17 kids per, like you said, there's different per class.
So, at the secondary level, it's I don't wanna say it's easier, but, right now our schools are in a good place, and secondary schools, middle and high schools can typically accommodate more kids if need be, just because of the way they're structured. You can have teachers on carts, you can there's a lot of ways to make it work, but right now our secondary schools are in a good place. In 2019, we were struggling with our elementaries because they're also different and they're when they were built. So we went through in 2019, I did, and went and talked to the principals. What space do you have available? What do we think your capacity would be and it becomes hard because we're looking at how many regular classrooms could we support in that building. knowing that every regular classroom means that you've got a specials teacher, you've got special ed, you've got counselors, you've got all these other factors. And so I do have those numbers, and they're pretty accurate, especially when we look at like schools like Independence, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, I don't know if someone does, but and in 2019, we looked at about, and again, there's gonna be a range here, because you don't know where the kids funnel in, this isn't the perfect science, but we said about 760 students would be our top end for Independence. We wouldn't wanna go much above that. Right now, I think they're 769 or something like that. And we can walk through Independence and say there's no open classrooms. So we do have at least what we've used as a model, as a starting point. And again, using Independence, when we saw that Independence had hit that number this summer, there was a conversation with the principal about what are you really at, what are you feeling? And it was, I don't have any other classrooms to put kids in. I couldn't add a second grade room if I needed to right now, without really putting some additional stress on the buildings. Like, I would have to make a decision about moving a program out of this classroom, like one of our special ed rooms, putting it in a smaller room, and that's not ideal. So there was a decision and a conversation about needing to make sure we don't add kids to Independence if we don't have to. So.
I think the other part, Randy, where that's a little bit challenging is that, you know, when you think in any given building, if we're needing to add an extra 5th grade section and take over a kindergarten room that was, you know, 25% larger, well, you could go from 25 5th graders up to 32 in that room. If you're trying to add an extra 5th grade classroom into one of our smaller classrooms, well, they're bigger humans at that point, and the capacity isn't going to be the same. So there's limits to it. But
I think one of the things that no one wants to talk about or even likes to think about, we're very fortunate here with our elementary class sizes. We have far better elementary class sizes here than I have been accustomed to in other places. We are at the desirable level. 18 in a class is, and not all classes have 18. 18 to 22 in an elementary class, that's really great. 22 in a 5th grade, I never got to have 22 kids in my 5th grade class. I always had 27, 28, 29, 30. I can't imagine how great it would have been to have 22. And when you think about capacity, that's a huge difference, the difference between 22 and 27 kids in a 4th or a 5th grade classroom, not just on building size, but on your fiscal capacity. And so as a community, we've been able to have that for a very long time. And if, you know, that's something where to maintain that, it takes money and it takes resources. And I think that's something as a community, as we think long-term, if that's something we really value, those low class sizes, making sure that we're able to fiscally support that will be very important for us as we move ahead as our enrollment declines. That just creates pressure to have to really have conversations that nobody wants to have, because a class size of 18 or 22 is ideal at elementary.
Yeah, I just, and your talk, Dr. Ruff, has helped, but one of my takeaways was, you know, that square footage formula. I thought the same thing. They say in here it's 25 years old, some method.
Well, like,
They're not
I,
quite the same schools they were 25 years ago.
to Ken's point, when you walk through Central Elementary at the end of all those hallways, those big open areas, and there's a lot of faculty space at Central that is not that student-centered, right? They're great faculty lounges, but you're not gonna put classrooms in them, and yet, when you just do that method where you're dividing kids by total square footage, it's kind of misleading. And I think the other challenge sometimes in my mind is the consistency of our building. If you look at some of our other local benchmark districts, they built one model of school, right? For multiple years, it was easy to project. Now we need to add 4 classrooms, we need to add this wing. Our buildings are all very different. And even with capacity, it's not always, you know, being a principal in a building, having a building at capacity isn't always great. I mean, you walk through, you know, Bryan Middle School, we were at almost 1,100 for a period of time. You walk down those hallways and it almost felt unsafe at times. There were that many kids, shoulder to shoulder, wall to wall, teachers on carts, lost instructional time because the teachers got to go from the first floor to the second floor with a cart of materials. And so You know, as you walk through some of our buildings right now, no doubt Henderson, you know, feels tight, needs things. Fairmont feels tight, needs things. But I think what you heard a lot of our principals say is it feels good, right? It feels comfortable right now. Like we're right where we need to be, and you know, we're able to support the needs of kids. We don't have we don't have every one of our buildings isn't a teacher in a 5x5 room, right? We don't want to get back to those days where we've been in some of our buildings, and that's what forced us to do those soft boundary changes across the district to alleviate some of those capacity issues that we've had.
I'll just make a comment. I don't, someone point out some different reasoning, but you know, the way I look at the enrollment here, I think it's good. I mean, from a school board member, the less kids we have here per tax dollar is better for the kids that choose to come here. So, and it could keep our tax rate low. If we had an influx of 1,000 kids, that would be a big problem. So, I'm not so gung ho to try to, you know, find why these kids aren't coming here. And, you know, if you don't come here, fine.
I would say as long as we don't change our state legislation that will have their funding start going with them to their private parochial and home schools. Because the pressure to do that in Jefferson City is extremely high, and a lot of that pressure comes from this part of the state. So it could forever have a tremendous impact on how we're able to fund our schools. And the conversations that take place around our taxes and changing how we do our local tax rates, that could have a forever impact on what we're able to do in schools. There's a lot of really important decisions taking place in Jefferson City that could have long-lasting impacts on public education.
Another challenging thing that we talk about is, so a decrease in 59 students this year that I think sometimes we look at that and say, well, you should be cutting 2 teachers from your budget next year. Well, if we had lost specifically 59 second graders at Central Elementary, yes, you might cut 2 teachers and you can move on. But when that's spread out somewhat evenly across 23 buildings, well, you can't. You know, and so that's where you have those slow incremental shifts in class sizes that change, and that's part of what we look at internally each year in making some of those decisions. And that's where we often hear it's about average class sizes, because, you know, yes, it might be 22 in 9 and 10 elementaries, and then this one does have 25, because we're looking at those averages across the board. It's a part of all what makes this challenging work to do when it comes to enrollment and projections. So we will board, I think I don't want to ask Dr. Borman and Dr. Oliver to have to do 14 individual tours, but I think to find a couple of days and at times when we could schedule, and if several of you are available to come do a walkthrough if you haven't done it, I think it really is important, those 2 buildings specifically. You can do it at all the buildings, but to see those 2 buildings during the instructional day and how they're having to operate and work based on the current configuration of the building and the enrollment numbers that we're seeing.
Anything else for it? No? Okay. Well, then that concludes our work session.
Questions of the carry?
We don't need a motion. We're just
Okay,
gonna.
it's just a work session.
Yeah, we're done.
Gotcha.
Unless you want to make a recommendation.